The Mississippi heat hung thick as molasses over the Fenwick plantation in the summer of 1866. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and the air itself seemed to whisper of secrets buried deep in the red clay soil. The war had ended over a year ago, but its scars still festered across the South like open wounds that refused to heal. Ezekiel Fenwick stood on the wraparound porch of his antebellum mansion, his weathered hands gripping a leather-bound Bible. At 62, he cut an imposing figure, tall, gaunt, with steel-grey eyes that seemed to pierce straight through to a person's soul. His black coat, despite the sweltering heat, never left his shoulders, and his voice carried the authority of a man who believed God spoke directly through him. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he murmured to his eldest son, Jeremiah, who stood beside him watching the field hands return from their day's labor. "This land has been blessed, boy, blessed and cursed in equal measure." Jeremiah, 28, and bearing his father's sharp features, nodded solemnly. "Yes, Papa, the Lord's will be done." The Fenwick family had owned this land for 3 generations, surviving the war through what Ezekiel claimed was divine intervention. While neighboring plantations burned and families fled north, the Fenwicks had somehow emerged unscathed. The locals whispered it was luck, but Ezekiel knew better. It was providence, payment for his unwavering devotion to God's true word. Inside the mansion, the family gathered for evening prayers, as they had every night for as long as anyone could remember. The parlor, with its heavy velvet curtains and dark mahogany furniture, felt more like a chapel than a living space. Religious paintings covered every wall, and crucifixes hung in each corner, casting long shadows in the flickering candlelight. Ezekiel's wife, Martha, sat rigid in her chair, her once beautiful face now gaunt and hollow-eyed. At 45, she looked 20 years older, her auburn hair streaked with premature grey and her hands constantly trembling. She rarely spoke anymore, except to recite scripture when prompted. Their 3 children completed the circle. Jeremiah, the dutiful eldest, Rebecca, 25, whose green eyes held a haunted quality that made visitors uncomfortable, and young Samuel, barely 16, who flinched whenever his father's gaze fell upon him. "Let us pray," Ezekiel commanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "For the Lord has shown me great visions, and we must prepare ourselves for his divine plan." As the family bowed their heads, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows beyond the window. A young woman named Clara Whitmore, the new school teacher who had arrived from Atlanta just 3 days prior. She had come to board with the neighboring Morrison family and had heard whispers about the Fenwicks during her brief time in town. Clara pressed closer to the window, straining to hear the patriarch's words. What she witnessed made her blood run cold. This wasn't prayer, it was something else entirely, something that made her skin crawl and her heart race with inexplicable dread. The next morning, Clara sat in the Morrison family's kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Mrs. Morrison, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes, noticed the young teacher's distressed appearance. "You look like you've seen a ghost, dear," Mrs. Morrison said, settling into the chair across from her. "Didn't sleep well?" Clara hesitated, unsure how to voice her concerns without sounding hysterical. "Mrs. Morrison, what can you tell me about the Fenwick family?" The older woman's expression immediately darkened, and she glanced toward the door as if ensuring they were alone. "Why do you ask, child?" I happened to walk past their property last evening and saw them through the window. Their evening prayers seemed unusual." Mrs. Morrison leaned forward, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "Listen to me carefully, Clara. The Fenwicks are not what they appear to be. That family has secrets darker than the bottom of the Mississippi River, and folks around here have learned not to ask too many questions." "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that make good Christian people cross themselves and hurry past their property after dark," Mrs. Morrison replied grimly. Ezekiel Fenwick claims to be a man of God, but there's something twisted in that house, something that ain't natural. Clara felt a chill run down her spine despite the morning heat. Have you ever seen anything yourself? Mrs. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, her fingers nervously working the hem of her apron. 3 years ago, during the worst of the war, my youngest boy went missing for 2 days. We found him wandering near the Fenwick property, couldn't remember where he'd been or what had happened to him, but he was changed. Wouldn't speak for weeks, and when he finally did, he kept talking about the man who speaks for God and the special prayers. Did you report it to the authorities? What authorities? Mrs. Morrison laughed bitterly. Sheriff Hawkins is Ezekiel's cousin, and half the town council owes the Fenwicks money. Besides, you can't prove what you can't understand, and nobody understands what goes on in that house. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats approached the Morrison property. Through the kitchen window, Clara saw Jeremiah Fenwick riding up the dusty path, his black horse snorting and pawing at the ground. "Speak of the devil," Mrs. Morrison muttered, rising from her chair. "Wonder what brings him here." Jeremiah dismounted and approached the front door with purposeful strides. His knock was firm and authoritative, echoing through the small farmhouse like a judge's gavel. Mrs. Morrison opened the door, her smile forced and uncomfortable. "Good morning, Jeremiah. What brings you by?" "Mrs. Morrison," he replied with a slight nod, his grey eyes scanning the interior of the house until they settled on Clara. "I understand you have a new boarder, a school teacher from Atlanta." "Yes, this is Miss Whitmore. Clara, this is Jeremiah Fenwick." Clara stood, extending her hand politely, but Jeremiah made no move to take it. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, as if tasting her name, "my father would like to extend an invitation for you to join our family for Sunday dinner. He believes it's important for the community's spiritual leaders to know one another." And the invitation felt more like a command, and Clara found herself struggling to find a polite way to decline. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Jeremiah interrupted, his smile never reaching his eyes. "My father insists. He has a particular interest in education, especially the education of young minds." Mrs. Morrison stepped closer to Clara, her protective instincts clearly activated. "I'm sure Miss Whitmore appreciates the invitation, but she's still settling in, and Sunday at 2 o'clock, Jeremiah said firmly, ignoring Mrs. Morrison entirely. "We'll send a carriage." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Miss Whitmore, I'd recommend wearing something modest. My father has strong opinions about proper Christian attire." After he left, Clara and Mrs. Morrison stood in stunned silence. Finally, the older woman shook her head and closed the door firmly. "That wasn't an invitation, dear," she said grimly. "That was a summons, and I'm afraid you don't have much choice but to answer it." Sunday morning dawned grey and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Clara had spent the previous 2 days in a state of growing anxiety, unable to shake the feeling that accepting the Fenwick invitation was a terrible mistake. Yet, as Mrs. Morrison had pointed out, refusing would likely cause more problems than accepting. She dressed carefully in her most conservative outfit, a high-necked navy dress with long sleeves and a modest hemline. Her dark hair was pulled back severely and covered with a simple bonnet. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself, but she hoped the austere appearance would meet with Ezekiel Fenwick's approval. At precisely 2 o'clock, a black carriage pulled up to the Morrison property. The driver, a thin man with hollow cheeks and nervous eyes, barely acknowledged Clara as she climbed aboard. The ride to the Fenwick plantation was conducted in complete silence, the only sounds being the clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. As they approached the mansion, Clara was struck by how different it looked in daylight. The white columns that had seemed stately from a distance were now revealed to be cracked and stained, and the gardens that had once been meticulously maintained showed signs of neglect. Spanish moss hung from the trees like tattered curtains, and the very air seemed to carry a sense of decay. The carriage stopped at the front steps, and before Clara could gather her courage, the massive front door opened. Ezekiel Fenwick emerged, dressed in his customary black coat despite the heat, his Bible clutched in one hand. "Miss Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Welcome to our humble home. The Lord has blessed us with your presence." Clara stepped down from the carriage, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Fenwick. It's very kind of you." "Kindness has nothing to do with it," he replied, his steel-grey eyes studying her intently. "This is God's will. Come, let me introduce you to my family." He led her into the mansion's foyer, where the rest of the Fenwick family waited in a formal receiving line. Martha Fenwick stood beside her husband, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. Her smile was forced and brittle, never quite reaching her haunted eyes. "Mrs. Fenwick," Clara said, offering her hand, "thank you for having me." Martha's handshake was brief and cold, her fingers trembling slightly. "Welcome," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rebecca Fenwick stood next to her mother, and Clara was immediately struck by the young woman's beauty, and by the sadness that seemed to emanate from her like a physical presence. Her green eyes were rimmed with dark circles, and her auburn hair, though elaborately styled, couldn't hide the gauntness of her face. "Miss Fenwick," Clara said warmly, hoping to establish some connection with someone closer to her own age. Rebecca's response was a barely perceptible nod, her gaze quickly dropping to the floor as if she were afraid to make eye contact. Young Samuel stood at the end of the line, and Clara's heart immediately went out to him. At 16, he should have been full of energy and life, but instead he seemed to shrink into himself, his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting nervously between his father and the floor. "Samuel," Ezekiel said sharply, "greet our guest properly." The boy straightened immediately, his face pale. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore. Welcome to our home." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Samuel," Clara replied gently, noting how the boy flinched when she spoke his name. Jeremiah appeared from the parlor, having changed from his riding clothes into a formal black suit that made him look like an undertaker. "Miss Whitmore, I trust your journey was comfortable." "Yes, thank you. Excellent. Shall we proceed to dinner? Father has prepared a special blessing for the occasion." They moved into the dining room, where a long mahogany table was set with fine china and crystal that seemed oddly out of place in the oppressive atmosphere. Clara was seated to Ezekiel's right, with Martha across from her, and the children arranged according to what was clearly a strict hierarchy. As they took their seats, Clara noticed several disturbing details. The walls were covered with religious paintings, but they depicted scenes of suffering and damnation rather than salvation. Crucifixes hung at odd angles, and in the corner stood a large wooden cross that looked more like an instrument of torture than a symbol of faith. "Let us pray," Ezekiel announced, and the family immediately bowed their heads. But this wasn't like any prayer Clara had ever heard. Ezekiel's words were a strange mixture of biblical verses and personal interpretations that seemed to twist the meaning of Scripture into something dark and threatening. He spoke of purification through suffering, of the necessity of absolute obedience to God's chosen representatives, and of the special burden carried by those who truly understood divine will. As the prayer continued, Clara noticed that Martha was silently weeping, tears streaming down her face as she kept her head bowed. Rebecca's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her fingernails were drawing blood, and Samuel was trembling visibly. "Amen," Ezekiel finally concluded, and the family echoed the word with obvious relief. Dinner was served by silent servants who moved like ghosts through the room, their eyes downcast and their movements quick and nervous. The food was elaborate but tasteless, and conversation was stilted and uncomfortable. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," Ezekiel said as they ate, "what are your views on the proper education of children?" Clara chose her words carefully. "I believe children should be taught to think critically and to question the world around them. Education should open minds, not close them." Ezekiel's expression darkened. "Questioning can be dangerous, Miss Whitmore. Children need guidance, not independence. They need to learn obedience before they can learn wisdom. But surely, encouraging curiosity and independent thought is the path to damnation." Ezekiel interrupted sharply. "The serpent in Eden encouraged Eve to question God's word, and look where that led. No, Miss Whitmore, true education teaches submission to proper authority." Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the full implications of his words. This wasn't just religious conservatism, this was something far more sinister. "I see," she said carefully. "And who determines what constitutes proper authority?" Ezekiel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Those whom God has chosen to speak for him, of course. Those who understand his true will." The conversation continued in this vein throughout the meal, with Ezekiel expounding on his twisted theology while his family sat in terrified silence. Clara began to understand that this dinner wasn't just a social courtesy, it was an interrogation, a test of her beliefs and her potential usefulness to whatever dark purpose the Fenwick patriarch had in mind. As the afternoon wore on, the storm that had been threatening finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the old mansion to its foundations. In the flickering candlelight, the religious paintings on the walls seemed to move and writhe, their subjects' eyes following Clara wherever she looked. "It seems you'll be staying longer than planned," Ezekiel observed with satisfaction as lightning illuminated the dining room in stark white flashes. "The Lord has provided us with more time to discuss your educational philosophy." Clara's heart sank as she realized she was trapped in this house of horrors, at least until the storm passed. And as she looked around the table at the terrified faces of the Fenwick family, she began to suspect that the weather might be the least of her concerns. "Perhaps," Ezekiel continued, his voice taking on an ominous tone, "you would like to see our private chapel? I think you would find our evening devotions enlightening." The storm raged with increasing fury as Ezekiel led Clara through the mansion's labyrinthine corridors. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced Fenwick ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her movement through the flickering candlelight. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet, and somewhere in the distance, Clara could hear what sounded like muffled sobbing. "The chapel is in the oldest part of the house," Ezekiel explained as they walked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Built by my grandfather in 1823, when the Lord first revealed to our family the true nature of his divine plan." They descended a narrow staircase that Clara was certain hadn't been part of the original house tour. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of dampness and something else, something organic and unpleasant, filled her nostrils. "Mr. Fenwick," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady, "perhaps we should wait for the storm to pass before—" "The storm is God's will," he interrupted, not turning around. "Just as your presence here tonight is God's will. Everything happens according to his divine plan, Miss Whitmore. Everything." At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Ezekiel produced an ornate key from his coat pocket and unlocked it with a sound that seemed to echo through Clara's bones. The chapel beyond was unlike any house of worship Clara had ever seen. The room was circular, with stone walls that wept moisture, and a domed ceiling painted with disturbing religious imagery. Instead of traditional pews, there were wooden benches arranged in concentric circles around a raised platform in the center. But it was what occupied the platform that made Clara's blood run cold. A massive wooden cross dominated the space, but this wasn't the simple symbol of Christian faith she was familiar with. This cross was carved with intricate symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight, and iron shackles hung from its arms. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Ezekiel said, noting her horrified expression. "My grandfather commissioned it from a craftsman in New Orleans. The man claimed it was blessed by a priest, but I suspect the blessing came from a very different source." Around the walls, Clara noticed alcoves containing what appeared to be religious artifacts, but upon closer inspection, they were revealed to be instruments of torture, disguised as holy relics. Whips hung beside crucifixes, and iron brands were displayed like sacred vessels. "This is where we conduct our true worship," Ezekiel continued, moving to light additional candles around the room. "Where we strip away the lies and pretenses of conventional Christianity and embrace God's actual will." "I don't understand," Clara whispered, though part of her was beginning to understand all too well. "Of course you don't. You've been poisoned by the weak, corrupted version of faith that passes for Christianity in the modern world. But here, in this sacred space, we practice the true religion, the religion of absolute submission, of purification through suffering, of redemption through pain." As if summoned by his words, the rest of the Fenwick family began filing into the chapel. Martha entered first, her face completely blank, as if she had retreated so far into herself that nothing of her original personality remained. Rebecca followed, moving like a sleepwalker, her green eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. Samuel came last, and Clara's heart broke at the sight of him. The 16-year-old boy looked like he had aged years in the few hours since dinner, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Take your places," Ezekiel commanded, and his family arranged themselves on the benches with the practiced efficiency of long habit. Clara remained standing near the door, every instinct screaming at her to run, but the storm outside and the locked door behind her made escape impossible. "Miss Whitmore," Ezekiel said, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon, "tonight you will witness the true power of faith. Tonight you will see what happens when human will is completely surrendered to divine authority." He moved to a lectern beside the cross and opened his Bible, but Clara could see that the pages had been altered, with new text written in the margins and certain passages crossed out or modified. "The Lord spoke to me in a vision," Ezekiel began, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. "He showed me the weakness of modern Christianity, the way it coddles the flesh and ignores the necessity of suffering. He revealed to me the true path to salvation, through absolute obedience, through the surrender of will, through the embrace of divine punishment." As he spoke, Martha began to rock back and forth, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been the desperate mutterings of a broken mind. Rebecca sat perfectly still, but tears streamed down her face in an endless flow. "The Bible tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," Ezekiel continued, his eyes blazing with fanatic fervor. "But modern preachers have forgotten what true fear means. They speak of God's love, but they ignore his wrath. They promise comfort, but they deny the necessity of suffering." He gestured toward the cross with its terrible shackles. "Here, we remember the truth. Here, we practice the old ways, the ways that our ancestors understood before the world grew soft and corrupt." Clara realized with growing horror that this wasn't just religious extremism. This was something far worse. The Fenwick family had created their own twisted version of Christianity, one that justified unspeakable acts in the name of divine will. "Samuel!" Ezekiel called suddenly, and the boy jumped as if struck. "Come forward, my son. It's time for your weekly purification." "No," Clara said before she could stop herself. "He's just a child." Ezekiel turned to her with a smile that chilled her to the bone. "Children are born in sin, Miss Whitmore. They must be cleansed regularly, or the corruption will spread. Samuel understands this, don't you, boy?" Samuel stood on trembling legs, his face white as parchment. "Yes, Papa," he whispered. "I understand. That's my good boy. Now come, let us wash away your sins." As Samuel began walking toward the cross, Clara knew she had to act. Whatever was about to happen, she couldn't stand by and watch. But before she could move, the chapel door burst open with a crash that echoed through the stone chamber. Sheriff Hawkins stood in the doorway, water streaming from his rain-soaked coat, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Behind him were two deputies, their faces grim and determined. "That's enough, Ezekiel," the sheriff said, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade. "Step away from the boy." Ezekiel's face contorted with rage. "You have no authority here, cousin. This is God's house, and I am his chosen representative. This ends tonight," Sheriff Hawkins replied firmly. "I've been turning a blind eye for too long, but no more. Mrs. Morrison sent word about Miss Whitmore's concerns, and I've been investigating. What you're doing here isn't religion, it's madness." "You don't understand," Ezekiel snarled, clutching his modified Bible to his chest. "None of you understand. I've been chosen to restore the true faith, to show the world what real Christianity looks like. What it looks like is child abuse and torture," the sheriff shot back. "Now step away from your family and come with us peacefully." For a moment, the chapel was silent, except for the sound of rain pounding against the stone walls. Then Ezekiel threw back his head and laughed, a sound so filled with madness and malice that it seemed to echo from the very depths of hell itself. "You think you can stop God's work?" he screamed. "You think your earthly authority means anything in the face of divine will?" He raised his hands toward the painted ceiling, and Clara could swear she saw the carved symbols on the cross begin to glow with an unholy light. "I call upon the powers that have blessed this house," Ezekiel cried. "I call upon the spirits that have guided our family for 3 generations. Protect your faithful servant from these agents of corruption." The candles around the chapel suddenly flared brighter, casting wild shadows on the walls. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Clara's breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls of the old mansion, came a sound that would haunt Clara's nightmares for the rest of her life. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from something far larger and more terrible than any earthly creature. The growling sound reverberated through the chapel's stone walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sheriff Hawkins and his deputies exchanged nervous glances, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons, while the Fenwick family remained frozen in their positions like statues carved from fear itself. "What in God's name?" one of the deputies began, but his words were cut off as the chapel's heavy door slammed shut behind them with a resounding crash that shook dust from the ancient stones. Ezekiel's laughter grew more maniacal, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight, like those of a wild animal. "You see," he cried triumphantly, "the Lord protects his chosen. You cannot stop what has been ordained." Clara pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The rational part of her insisted that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the old house had structural problems, or the storm was causing unusual acoustic effects. But the primal part of her brain, the part that had kept her ancestors alive through countless generations of danger, was screaming that something genuinely evil had awakened in this place. Sheriff Hawkins, to his credit, maintained his composure despite the supernatural display. "I don't care what tricks you're playing, Ezekiel," he said firmly, drawing his pistol. "This ends now. Release your family and surrender yourself." "My family belongs to God," Ezekiel replied, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality that seemed to echo from multiple directions. "They have been consecrated to his service, purified through suffering, made perfect through pain. You cannot take them from their divine purpose." Martha Fenwick suddenly stood up from her bench, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. When she spoke, her voice was hollow and distant, as if coming from the bottom of a deep well. "He speaks the truth," she said, her dead eyes fixed on the sheriff. "We belong to the darkness now. We have seen the true face of God, and it is terrible and beautiful beyond human comprehension." Rebecca rose next, her once beautiful face now a mask of madness and despair. "The pain cleanses us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "The suffering makes us pure. We are his chosen vessels, his instruments of divine will." Even young Samuel stood, though Clara could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Part of him, the part that was still an innocent 16-year-old boy, wanted to run to the sheriff for protection. But another part, the part that had been systematically broken and rebuilt in his father's image, compelled him to join the family's twisted chorus. "We are blessed," he said, though tears streamed down his face as he spoke the words. "We are the elect, the saved, the purified." Sheriff Hawkins looked around the chapel with growing alarm, realizing that he wasn't just dealing with one madman, but with an entire family that had been systematically brainwashed and possibly worse. "Listen to me," he said, addressing Martha, Rebecca, and Samuel directly. "Whatever he's done to you, whatever he's made you believe, it's not too late. You can still be free." "Free?" Ezekiel laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the circular chamber. "They are already free. Free from the burden of independent thought, free from the weakness of human will, free from the corruption of the outside world. They have achieved perfect submission to divine authority." As he spoke, Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. The carved symbols on the massive cross were definitely glowing now, pulsing with a sickly green light that seemed to have no earthly source. And the iron shackles hanging from its arms were moving slightly, as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. "Sheriff," she whispered urgently, "we need to get out of here, now." But before anyone could move, the chapel was suddenly filled with a sound that defied description, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. They were singing, but it wasn't any hymn Clara had ever heard. The melody was ancient and discordant, the words in a language that predated Christianity by millennia. Ezekiel raised his arms toward the painted ceiling, his face transformed by religious ecstasy. "They come," he cried, "the old ones, the true gods, the powers that ruled before the wee carpenter's son corrupted the world with his message of love and forgiveness." The temperature in the chapel dropped even further, and Clara's breath now came in visible puffs. Ice began forming on the stone walls, and the candle flames turned from yellow to an eerie blue-green that cast everything in a hellish glow. "This is impossible," one of the deputies muttered, his voice shaking. "This can't be happening." But Sheriff Hawkins, despite his fear, remained focused on his duty. "Ezekiel Fenwick," he shouted over the growing supernatural cacophony, "I'm placing you under arrest for child endangerment, assault, and whatever other charges I can think of once we get out of this madhouse." He started toward the patriarch, but Ezekiel raised his hand and spoke a single word in that same ancient language the voices were using. The sheriff stopped dead in his tracks, his body rigid as if he had been turned to stone. "You still don't understand," Ezekiel said, his voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "This house, this land, this family, we are all part of something much larger than your small minds can comprehend. For 3 generations, the Fenwicks have served the old powers, the true gods who ruled before the Christian usurpers claimed dominion over the earth." Clara's mind reeled as the pieces began falling into place. The family's survival during the war, their apparent immunity to the economic devastation that had destroyed their neighbors, the strange atmosphere that surrounded their property. It all made a horrible kind of sense if you accepted that they had made some sort of pact with forces beyond human understanding. "My grandfather discovered the truth," Ezekiel continued, his eyes now glowing with the same sickly light as the cross. He found the old texts, learned the old ways, made the old bargains. In exchange for our service, our devotion, our willingness to prepare the way for their return, we were granted protection and prosperity. At what cost? Clara managed to ask, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. Ezekiel turned to her with a smile that revealed teeth that were no longer entirely human. The cost was our humanity, Miss Whitmore. A small price to pay for eternal servitude to beings of infinite power and wisdom. The singing voices grew louder, and Clara realized with mounting horror that they were coming from the Fenwick family themselves. Martha, Rebecca, and Samuel were all chanting in that ancient tongue, their voices blending with others that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the chapel. And then, impossibly, the massive cross began to move. It rotated slowly on its base, the carved symbols now blazing with light so bright it hurt to look at directly. The iron shackles clanked and rattled as if something invisible was struggling within them. "The gateway opens," Ezekiel announced with religious fervor. "The old ones return to reclaim what was always theirs, and we, their faithful servants, will be rewarded for our centuries of patient preparation." Sheriff Hawkins, still frozen in place by whatever supernatural force Ezekiel had invoked, could only watch in helpless horror as reality itself seemed to bend and warp around the rotating cross. The air in the chapel began to shimmer like heat waves, and through the distortion, Clara caught glimpses of something vast and terrible pressing against the barriers between worlds. But then, just as it seemed that whatever cosmic horror the Fenwicks had been serving was about to break through into their reality, a new voice cut through the supernatural chaos. Young Samuel's voice, speaking not in the ancient tongue, but in plain English. "No," he said, his words carrying surprising strength despite his youth. "I won't do this anymore. I won't be part of this madness." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The rotating cross shuddered to a halt. The glowing symbols flickered and dimmed, and the temperature in the chapel began to rise toward normal levels. Ezekiel spun toward his youngest son with fury and disbelief. "Samuel, you dare defy the will of the old ones. You dare break the sacred covenant." But Samuel, for the first time in his young life, stood his ground. "They're not gods," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They're parasites. They've been feeding on our family's pain and suffering for generations, growing stronger while we grew weaker and more twisted." "You don't understand what you're doing," Ezekiel snarled, advancing on the boy with murder in his eyes. "You'll doom us all." "No," Samuel replied firmly. "I'll free us all." "Dee." And with that, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather journal, his grandfather's original diary, the one that contained the true history of the Fenwick family's pact with darkness. "This is how it really started," he announced, holding the journal high. "Not with divine revelation, but with desperation. Great-grandfather was facing bankruptcy and ruin when he found these old texts. He didn't make a deal with gods, he made a deal with demons. And every generation since has paid the price." As Samuel spoke, Clara could see the supernatural forces in the chapel beginning to weaken. The voices faded to whispers, the strange lights dimmed, and the oppressive atmosphere that had dominated the room began to lift. But Ezekiel wasn't finished yet. With a roar of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, he lunged toward his son, his hands outstretched like claws. "You will not destroy everything I've built!" he screamed. "You will not betray our sacred trust." Samuel dodged his father's attack with surprising agility, clutching the leather journal to his chest as if it were a shield against the darkness that had consumed his family for generations. The movement broke whatever supernatural hold had been keeping Sheriff Hawkins frozen, and the lawman immediately sprang into action. "That's enough!" Hawkins shouted, tackling Ezekiel before the patriarch could reach his son. The two men crashed to the stone floor in a tangle of limbs, Ezekiel fighting with the desperate strength of a man whose entire worldview was crumbling around him. "You don't understand!" Ezekiel screamed as the sheriff wrestled him into submission. "Without the covenant, without their protection, we're nothing. The family will be destroyed. The land will be cursed. Everything will fall apart." "Maybe that's for the best," Samuel said quietly, opening his great-grandfather's journal and beginning to read aloud from its yellowed pages. "Listen to this. The entities I have contacted promise wealth and power, but the price grows steeper with each passing year. They demand more suffering, more pain, more complete submission. I fear I have doomed my descendants to an eternity of servitude, to beings that care nothing for human welfare." As Samuel read, the supernatural atmosphere in the chapel continued to dissipate. The carved symbols on the cross faded to ordinary wood, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on everyone in the room lifted like fog before the morning sun. Martha Fenwick suddenly collapsed onto her bench, her body racked with sobs as if she were awakening from a decades-long nightmare. "Oh God!" she wailed. "What have we done? What have we become?" Rebecca fell to her knees beside her mother, her own tears flowing freely as the fog of madness that had clouded her mind for so long finally began to clear. "Mama," she whispered, "I remember now. I remember what we used to be before Papa changed everything." Clara moved carefully toward the two women, her heart breaking at the sight of their anguish. These weren't evil people. They were victims, prisoners in their own home, their minds and spirits systematically broken by a man who had convinced himself that his cruelty was divine will. "It's over now," she said softly, kneeling beside Rebecca and taking her hand. "You're free now, all of you." Sheriff Hawkins had succeeded in restraining Ezekiel, though the patriarch continued to struggle and rant about divine punishment and cosmic retribution. "The old ones will not be denied," he screamed. "They will find another way, another family, another covenant. You cannot stop what has been set in motion." "Maybe not," Samuel said, still reading from the journal, "but we can stop being part of it." He looked up at the sheriff. "There's more here. Names, dates, descriptions of rituals. Everything you'd need to understand what's been happening in this house for the past 40 years. Hawkins nodded grimly. "We'll need all of it for evidence. This family is going to need a lot of help to recover from what's been done to them." As if to emphasize his point, Martha suddenly looked up with eyes that were clearer than they had been in years. "Sheriff," she said, her voice hoarse but determined, "there are others. Other families in the county who've made similar bargains. Ezekiel wasn't the only one who found those cursed texts." "How many others?" Hawkins asked, though Clara could tell from his expression that he dreaded the answer. "At least 3 that I know of," Martha replied. "The Blackwoods over in Yazoo County, the Harpers near Vicksburg, and the Crenshaw family down in Natchez. They all have the same arrangements." Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just one family's descent into madness. It was part of a larger network of corruption that had been spreading through the Mississippi Delta like a cancer. "We'll deal with them one at a time," Sheriff Hawkins said firmly. "But first, we need to get you all out of this house and somewhere safe." As they prepared to leave the chapel, Samuel made one final gesture that would stay with Clara for the rest of her life. He walked over to the massive cross that had been the centerpiece of his family's twisted worship, and, with strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his 16 years, began dismantling it piece by piece. "This ends here," he said as he worked, his voice carrying a conviction that belied his youth. "This evil ends with our generation." Ezekiel watched his son's actions with a mixture of rage and despair. "You're destroying everything," he whispered, his voice broken. 40 years of faithful service, 40 years of sacrifice, all for nothing. "Not for nothing," Samuel replied, not looking up from his work. "For freedom, for the chance to be human again." As they finally left the chapel and made their way back through the mansion's corridors, Clara noticed that the oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the house was already beginning to lift. The portraits on the walls no longer seemed to watch their movements. The shadows no longer held menacing shapes, and the very air felt lighter and cleaner. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a clear night sky filled with stars. The contrast between the beauty of the natural world and the horror they had just escaped was almost overwhelming. Sheriff Hawkins helped load the Fenwick family into his wagon, treating them with the gentle care of someone who understood that they were victims rather than criminals. Ezekiel, still ranting about divine retribution, was secured separately for everyone's safety. "What will happen to them?" Clara asked as they prepared to depart. "The state has facilities for people who've suffered this kind of trauma," Hawkins replied. "It'll take time, maybe years, but with proper care and treatment, they might be able to rebuild their lives." "And the house?" "We'll burn it," Samuel said firmly from the back of the wagon. "Every board, every stone, every trace of what happened here. The land can heal, but the house has to go." As they rode away from the Fenwick plantation, Clara looked back one last time at the mansion silhouetted against the starry sky. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw shapes moving in the windows, dark figures watching their departure with malevolent eyes. But then Samuel began to sing. Not one of the twisted hymns his father had taught him, but a simple song his mother had sung to him as a small child before the darkness had claimed their family. His voice was young and clear and purely human, and it seemed to drive away whatever shadows still lingered in that cursed place. 3 months later, Clara stood in the same spot where the Fenwick mansion had once loomed over the Mississippi landscape. True to Samuel's word, the house had been completely destroyed, burned to the ground in a fire that had taken 3 days to fully extinguish. The land itself was already beginning to heal, with new grass growing where the old foundations had been and wildflowers blooming in what had once been the mansion's shadow. Samuel stood beside her, looking healthier and more at peace than she had ever seen him. Under the care of doctors in Jackson, he had made remarkable progress in recovering from the psychological trauma of his upbringing. His mother and sister were also improving, slowly but steadily reclaiming their humanity from the darkness that had consumed it. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked him. "Destroying everything your family had built?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't found the courage to speak up," he said finally. "But then I remember what we were becoming, what we had already become. And I know I made the right choice." He gestured toward the empty land where his family's house of horrors had once stood. "This is clean now, pure. Whatever evil my great-grandfather invited into our lives is gone, and it can never come back." Clara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't entirely over. Sheriff Hawkins had indeed investigated the other families Martha had mentioned, and what he had found had led to arrests and interventions across 3 counties. But she suspected that there were other families, other houses, other dark covenants that had yet to be discovered. "What will you do now?" she asked Samuel. "Go to school," he replied with a smile that was purely his own, untainted by his father's madness. "Learn everything I can about the real world, the good world. Maybe become a teacher myself someday. Help other children who've been hurt by the adults who were supposed to protect them." As they walked away from the empty lot where the Fenwick mansion had once stood, Clara felt a sense of hope that she hadn't experienced since arriving in Mississippi. Evil had been defeated here, not through supernatural intervention or divine miracle, but through the simple courage of a young man who had refused to accept that cruelty and suffering were the will of God. The sun was setting over the Mississippi Delta, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead. And for the first time since she had arrived in this troubled land, Clara believed that promise might actually be true. Behind them, the wind rustled through the new grass growing where the Fenwick house had stood, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the sound of birds singing their evening songs. The land was healing, the darkness was lifting, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. Not the twisted mockery of faith that had echoed from the Fenwick chapel, but the genuine call to worship of a community that understood the difference between love and fear, between faith and fanaticism. The most horrific practices of the Fenwick family had finally come to an end, but their story would serve as a warning for generations to come. That evil often wears the mask of righteousness, that cruelty can disguise itself as devotion, and that sometimes the greatest act of faith is the courage to say no to those who claim to speak for God. As Clara and Samuel walked toward town, neither of them looked back. The past was buried, the future was bright, and the long nightmare of the Fenwick family was finally, truly over.